It's the introduction to the clinical neurology. We talk about the basic facts about the clinical neurology. And this is an introductory lecture to the second and third lecture and the lecture for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow about certain problems with nervous system disorders. But to understand the problems of the nervous system disorders, we have to have an idea about the basic knowledge of the clinical neurophysiology and the neuroanatomy. So this is about the basic neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology. Basically, the nerve cells are divided into two categories or two types. The first one is the neuron, which is the basic nerve cells, neuron. And we have types or variety of neurons. And we have the other types is the glial cells. And by glial cells, we mean the supporting cells. And the glial cells are many types. We'll discuss it later on. So the glial cells are types. One of these glial cells is the astrocytes. The astrocyte, and the astrocyte, by its feet, support the neurons. So the neurons are suspended inside the nervous system by the astrocytes. Also, we have another glial cells, and that's the oligodendrocytes. The oligodendrocytes is the function of it, the formation of myelin sheath. The formation of myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is the covering of the axon of the neuron. This is the neurons, this is the body of the neurons, and this is the axon. And the axon is covered by the myelin sheath, which we'll discuss it later on. Also, we have the Schwann cell. It's the covering of also myelin, but not in the central nervous system. It's mainly in the peripheral nervous system. We have other cells like the microglia cells. Now, this is the basic unit, the neurons. And the neuron, as you said, it's the body of the neurons, body of the cells, and the nucleus there. And we have the axon. And the axon is covered by the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath has many, many functions formed by the oligodendrocytes. Okay, we start with the astrocytes. These are one type of the glial cell. The astrocyte it forms the framework. Framework means like a mesh-like, a framework. And in that framework, like a net, and the neurons are suspended in that net. And the astrocyte has the following function. Function number one is supporting the neuron. The neuron is suspended in that astrocyte, and it is supported by the astrocyte. Number one. Number two, it has very important function, and that is the biochemical control of the neuron environment. The neuron environment should have a specific environment, and that specific environment is So, the biochemical control of the neuron environment. And the third thing, which is very important, it is very important for the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is formed by the astrocyte food. Now, the blood-brain barrier, from the name, a barrier, it's like the first line which separate the nerve tissue cells from the outside. Anything which should be or could enter in the nervous system, it should first passes through the barriers, the neuro barriers, called blood-brain barriers. So this is the function of the first type of the glial cell, and that's the astrocyte. Now, this is the astrocyte, this is the body of the astrocyte, and these are the feet of the astrocyte. And this is the axon of the neuron, and this is suspended by these feet of the astrocytes. The other glial cells, or supporting cell, is the oligodendrocyte, which is very, very important cells. The oligodendrocyte has the function of, number one, formation and maintenance of the myelin sheath. Formation and maintenance of the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is very important and has a value for the transmission of the action potential. The action potential, we mean the neurological signals. The neurological signals, which is formed inside the body of the neuron, should be transmitted in the axon. And the speed of transmissions depend on the covering of the axon, on the myelin sheath. So it is very important in the transmission. That's why, for example, tomorrow we'll talk about disorders of the nervous system called demyelinating diseases, like multiple sclerosis. And in those group of disorders or demyelinating disease, it is an autoimmune disease which acts on the myelin sheath, leading to the destruction of the myelin sheath. So the axon will be exposed, and the transmission of the signals, the neurological signals, will be delayed. And once the transmission is delayed, the total functions of the nervous system will be delayed and disordered. So this is the oligodendrocyte. Now what about the neuron? The neuron, or the nerve cell, it's the basic unit. It has the following character. Why تحفظوها? Comes as a multiple choice question. Number one, it has limitless connections, many connections, unlimited connection. This is number one. Number two, it has the character of adaptability and variability of function. It has many functions, variety of functions, could adapt itself to certain function of the nervous system. This is number two. And number three, the third character is it has several projections. And one of these projections, the main one, is the axon. And through that axon, it transmits the impulses which are generated inside the neuron body, inside the neuron body. Okay. Now, the nervous system. استريحوا يا رجال، استريحوا. اجلس رجال. اجلس. The nervous system has organized itself in a special anatomical and physiological organization. ترتب حالة nervous system in a special type of anatomical organization, so it will function properly. And this organization, this diagram will illustrate the organization. We start with the central part, the main part, cerebral cortex, on the top. Cerebral cortex, where many functions of the nervous system are carried out. And these functions and orders sent down to the body through many systems. So on the top, we have the cerebral cortex, and it sends order down. For example, it sends order through thalamus, and at the same time, it receives signals from the thalamus. So it's on and off, okay? Afferent and efferent. Also, below that, we have the brainstem. And we'll discuss the brainstem later on, which is very, very important structure of the central nervous system. And below the brainstem, we have the spinal cord. So we are going down slowly. Cerebral cortex, brainstem, and then spinal cord, and then we have the, later on, we have the peripheral, from the spinal cord, peripheral roots and spinal nerves to the muscle. Also, we have two other important structures. Number one is the cerebellum. So cerebellum, it helps the central nervous system. For example, the nervous system gives orders for movement, and this movement should be coordinated, and the coordination is carried out through the cerebellum. So it has function helping the central nervous system. Other system is the basal ganglia. We'll talk about later on. Basal ganglia, which form a system called extrapyramidal system. And also it has special function. We'll talk about it later on. So this is a diagram of how anatomically the nervous system is organized. Okay. Now, if we go in details, for example, to make it easy for us, we divide the nervous system into a central one, central nervous system, and a peripheral nervous system. And the central nervous system consists of, number one, is the brain. And the brain, or cerebral cortex, has 4 lobes: frontal, occipital, parietal, temporal. And each lobe has its function. Talk about it later. That's the cerebral cortex. Below it is the brainstem, which is composed of 3 parts. And that is the midbrain, the pons, and below that is the middle. Then we have the cerebellum, as I said, and spinal. So this is the shape of the central nervous system, This is the cerebral cortex with its 4 lobes. The frontal one, frontal lobe, and we have at the back occipital one, occipital lobe. Sorry, occipital lobe, that's the occipital lobe at the back. Frontal, occipital. Then we have temporal and parietal. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Frontal, occipital, parietal, and temporal. This is the cerebral cortex. Cerebellum, this is the cerebellum. And the brain stem, this is the brain stem. This is the brain stem. Okay. What about the other part of the nervous system? Is the peripheral one. Peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system composed of cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves are considered to be part of the peripheral nervous system. Cranial nerves. And we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And spinal nerve. Nerves which comes out from the spinal cord. And these spinal nerves, we have motor nerve, motor spinal nerve, we have sensory spinal nerve. And they are in total 31 pairs. 31 pairs. And these are cervical, 8 pairs, thoracic, 12 pairs, lumbar, 5, and sacral, 5, and 1 coccygeal. In total, 31. So that is the peripheral one, peripheral nervous system. Okay. We have a third system within the nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. ANS, the autonomic nervous system. اجلسوا يا بنات اجلسوا، أما تجلسوا وين طالعين؟ يلا استريحوا استريحوا. The autonomic nervous system divided into 2 types. The parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, and this is called craniosacral. Why called the craniosacral? Because it runs with subcranial nerves and also with sacral cranial nerves. For example, it runs the cranial nerve, the 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th, without cranial nerves. For example, when we discuss the function of the cranial nerve, 3rd cranial nerve, we know that the function of the 3rd cranial nerve has many functions, like motor functions for the levator palpebrae superioris, the eyelid, or the functions of the eye muscle, and also autonomic functions of the pupil, constrictions of the pupil. Okay? So it runs through the 3rd. The 7th, yes, the 7th cranial nerve. Although the 7th cranial nerve, it is the motor function of the facial muscle, but also it has autonomic nervous system functions for the lacrimal glands, as well as, of course, the 9th and 10th. These are the cranial nerves in which there is the autonomic nervous system embedded in. Also, it runs with the sacral spinal nerve, and mainly with the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th cranium. So that is the parasympathetic. What about the sympathetic? called thoracolumbar. Why called thoracolumbar? Because it runs with the thoracic cranial, spinal nerve and lumbar spinal nerve. استريح. يلا استريح. Okay. So, a trend with the thoracic and lumbar, and the thoracic spinal nerve and lumbar spinal nerve. So, a trend from the T1 thoracic down to L3. So, down to L3, from T1 to L3. And also, we have, besides the sympathetic trunk, and also the sympathetic ganglia. So this is a broad classification of how the nervous system is organized anatomically. What about the functional organization, the physiological organization? Because the nervous system has many functions. Motor function, sensory function, visual function, and so on. So, we have many functions, and these varieties of functions are through subsystems within the nervous system. Subsystem within the nervous system. So, we have, these are the central nervous system. This is the lobes of the brain or cerebral cortex, the 4 lobes, and each one has its function. Now, the cerebral function has the following actions. And these actions, we have start with cerebral hemisphere, cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex at that level, is the highest nervous system function is carried out. Of course, cerebral cortex, at that part of the nervous system, the higher function is carried out. So, the anterior half of the cerebral hemisphere, for example, the frontal and prefrontal lobes, deal with executive function of the human being. الأوامر الإدارية prefrontal. Very important. Decisions making, behavior, and others. قرارات اللي تصير. Everybody has decision making. So the anterior part of the cerebral cortex, prefrontal, at which the most important complex function of the nervous system. Okay. So this is a diagram of the cerebral cortex, and this is a diagram of the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is divided into multiple areas. For example, this area called the motor area, motor cortex, which is part of the motor system. Part of the motor system, and that area, the motor area, the initial motor signal is started. Okay? So the motor area, like a dynamo, sending a motor signals down to the body. So that's the first one, the motor area. And also we have premotor area. This is the premotor area. The premotor area is very important because at that part, the planning is done. Because for any motor action, we need, besides the motor power, we need the planning. For example, if I want to raise my hand and put it on my head, you need a motor function. But you need a plan for that. I raise the hand, then I go down on my head. Planning. That's why in early life, in childhood, infancy, the motor system is there. But the child cannot perform certain complex motor functions. Not he is paralyzed, no. But the planning is not mature. The planning area is not mature yet to give him how to do certain complex action. So the premotor, it is very, very important. The prefrontal, this is the prefrontal. The prefrontal, this is the area where the executive function, الأوامر الإدارية، الإدارة، كيف الإنسان يدير حاله، كيف يفكر، thinking, decision making, behavior, and these functions are mature as the human being is with time, child, then adolescent, then adult, then he will have certain thinking, certain behavior, and so on. So this is a very important prefrontal cortex. That's why later on you will see when a person who has a problem with the frontal lobe, mainly the prefrontal, you could have many symptoms like disinhibition, because we are raised to inhibit ourselves, not to do certain action in certain time or certain place. This is inhibition. But when there is a disease of the frontal lobe, especially in the prefrontal, there is what we call disinhibition. We will do improper action in improper time and improper place. So this is the prefrontal. Also, in the frontal lobe, we have the Broca's area. The Broca's area is the motor speech area, because the speech, as you will see later on, has two centers, Wernicke's and Broca's. Again, the Wernicke's and the temporoparietal area to receive the verbal stimulus and make analysis, and will send impulses through the arcuate fibers to the Broca's area. And the Broca's area will send order to the speech apparatus, pharynx, larynx, tongue, lips, to have a proper speech. Broca's area. So this is the frontal lobe substructures. Frontal lobe substructures. structures. Okay. And this is a very nice diagram about the cerebral cortex and the frontal area. The frontal, as we said, we have primary motor cortex. And we have many cells, motor cells, give motor action. But the body is represented upside down. The legs are up, the head is down. Upside down. And this is the pre-motor area, planning area, supplementary area. And this is the very important, the prefrontal area. Prefrontal area, which is executive function, behavior, and personality. Very important. Behavior, personality. Also, we have in the frontal lobe, we have the frontal eye field center. Frontal eye field center. Okay, so the motor area, voluntary muscle function, the premotor planning and coordination of movement, planning and coordination of movement, and the frontal eye field center for voluntary rapid eye movement. Rapid eye movement. For example, when you move your eye rapidly from the right to the left, right, left, through this center. Because we have two eye centers, one in the frontal lobe and the other one in the back. Okay, so these are the substructures of the frontal lobe. Okay, what about the posterior half of the cerebral cortex? The posterior half deals with perception of environment, receiving the environment. It receives all the stimuli from outside. And that gives us the feeling of that we are here. For example, we are in the environment, for example, at this time, we are in this lecture hall. Previously, an hour ago, probably we have in the car. So perceptions of the environment, posterior part of the cerebral cortex. And this is another diagram of the same thing for the brain. Okay. Okay. Also, the cerebral cortex is divided into left hemisphere and right hemisphere, two hemispheres. And we said that the cerebral cortex have four lobes, and four lobes on the right and on the left, divided. Because the function of the left side of the brain differs from the function of the right side of the brain. For example, the left side of the brain, the left side, has many functions. For example, calculation and number skills. Written language, reasoning, spoken language, scientific skills, and the most important is the right hand control. Most of us are right-handed because the center of the right hand control is in this left cerebral cortex. You will see later on. Because the fibers which comes from the left cerebral cortex goes down to the brainstem down to the medulla to cross to the opposite side. That's why left side of the brain control right side of the body. And the right side cerebral cortex control left side of the body. What about the right side? It has also many functions like the left hand control, music control, imagination, and also we have other functions like the insight and the art awareness. Okay. Now, we mentioned that the nervous system has many functions through subsystems. And one of these functions is the motor function. Motor function, which is essential function. We move our upper limbs, lower limbs, we walk, we do things by motor actions. And the motor action through the motor system. So, number one, we have the motor system called pyramidal system. Why called pyramidal system? Because the shape of the fibers are collected together like a pyramid. That's why I call a pyramidal system. Now, what is the detail of the anatomical organization of the motor system? Now, the motor system or pyramidal system, it is responsible for different movement of different parts of the body. And by the way, physiologically, any movement, it is the result of contractions or controlled relaxation of a group of muscles and never a single muscle. يعني each movement تحتاج إلى many muscles, not a single muscle. Okay, so to perform any action, motor action, we need the following part. Number one, the motor area, called primary motor area. And as you saw a few minutes ago, the primary motor area is in the frontal lobe. And that part is the starting of the action potential. The signal started there. So the group of cells of the motor cortex correspond to any movement. That's the motor area. Motor area. Okay. So the motor area, starting the signals, the motor signals, to give the movement. But this movement should be coordinated. And so we need another system, and that's the cerebellum. So the function of the cerebellum, it is a complement function, مكمل. واجبة الcerebellum مكمل إلى primary motor system. Complement function to the motor system. How it is complement? It helps in the coordination and in timing of the contractions and relaxations of the muscle. So that gives us a proper shape of the any motor function. For example, if I want to hold this bottle and raise it up, I need a motor function. But this action should be coordinated, steady, coordinated. Otherwise, if the cerebellum is distorted, there will be incoordination. Okay, so it's very important in coordination in time. And also in the second system is the extrapyramidal system, the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is It's also complementary function and give the movement the smooth and nice shape. Okay, so the cerebellum coordinate the movement, extrapyramidal give it the proper shape. And the motor area at which the initial spark of the voluntary movement. Okay. So, that is a diagram which illustrates clearly how this cortex, primary cerebral function motor, and that to send the motor function down. But we have many systems. Cerebellum coordinate through the thalamus to the cortex. The basal ganglia also coordinate the cerebral cortex. And then the motor signal goes down through the brainstem spine. Okay. In the spinal cord, when the signals come to the spinal cord, comes to the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord. It goes to the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord. Then from that, we have the spinal motor root and spinal motor nerves and neuromuscular junction and the muscle. And then the muscle will contract and relax. Okay. Also, so the order sent to the anterior horn cell. Also, it will send to the certain motor cranial nuclei. Motor cranial nuclei. Okay. So, in conclusion, a group of anterior horn cells correspond to a muscle. شباب ليش دخلتوا ليش طلعتوا؟ شو هذا؟ تسجلون بغياب. اللي يدخل محاضرة، مو يدخل ويطلع. محاضرة هاي الجاية تفيده بعدين تجي أسئلة ما بيحلها ويرجع دور ثاني ودور ثالث ودور رابع. ليش يا شباب؟ انتم طلاب طب. طالب الطب بعدين يصير طبيب. الطبيب he should have control of himself. He should have a proper behavior. لازم يكون عنده سلوك مهني. ما بيصير يدخل ويطلع قاعد محاضرات يعمل انترفيرنس. يعني انتم حتى لو اجتماعيا لو سمحتوا اجتماعيا جالسين باي مجلس ما بيطلع لك انه تطلع وتدخل تطلع وتدخل والمجلس موجود. لازم تستأذن وعندك اسباب ملحة. احتمال عندك اسباب ملحة بس تستأذن اول. احنا ما موجودين بقاعة سينما اللي بده يدخل واللي بده يطلع. هاي محاضرة. رجاء behave yourself properly. شكرا. So as he said, a group of anterior horn cells correspond to a muscle and a group of cells of the motor cortex correspond to a movement. رجعنا هدوء رجعنا هدوء رجعنا. اوكي. يعني الطالب مكان ما يكون جالس هون ويسمع محاضرة يطلع برا ويطلع برا ويجلس برا بالبرد ويظل يتكلم كلام لا يفيع ولا ينقص، بالعكس ينقص من عنده. ليش؟ انت جاي صاحي من بكير جايب سيارة، أنت بتحضر محاضرة تيجي 5 دقائق وتطلع برا، شو هذا الكلام؟ أنت جاي عشان بدك تحكي سوالف برا ولا جاي تاخذ محاضرة هون؟ لا يطلع هو كان، أنا متأكد هو من يطلع كأنه مستحي عامل شيء غلط يعني، أو هي عاملة شيء غلط، ما بيصير. فرجان الهدوء والانتظار. يعني احنا حصل اليوم وبكره وبعد بكره يوميا 3 محاضرات، موضوع طويل، نيرفس سيستم موضوع طويل كثير، فلازم يكون عندكم صبر شويه. اوكي. Now, if we discuss the anatomy of the motor system, as we mentioned, the anatomy of the motor system, we start, the motor is divided into the motor area. This motor area called precentral gyrus, PCG. Precentral gyrus ليش؟ لأنه حقيقة at the back of the frontal lobe, between the frontal at the back, there is a gyrus, there is a groove. And in front of that groove is the frontal area. That's why I call precentral gyrus. And in that area, precentral gyrus, the motor signal forms, and it passes down to the corticospinal tract. Why corticospinal? Because it joins the cortex to the spinal cord, called pyramidal tract, shaped like pyramid. So, corticospinal tract. And then when it's passed down, it passes through the internal capsule. Look, this is the motor area, precentral. This is the pyramidal fiber. Look, the shape like a pyramid. The shape is like a pyramid. That's why it's called pyramidal tract. Then the corticospinal tract passes through the internal capsule. This is the internal capsule. So it passes in the internal capsule. Then it leaves the cerebral cortex to reach the brainstem, then the medulla, then below the medulla, it crosses to the opposite side. And this is called lateral corticospinal tract, goes to the anterior horn cell. We have another fiber called anterior corticospinal tract, go directly, but it crosses later on. The crossing is late in the spinal cord. The lateral corticospinal tract, the crossing is early below the medulla, while the anterior corticospinal tract, the crossing is late in the spinal cord, goes to the anterior heart cells. So this is the anatomy of the motor system. Okay. The brainstem, the part below the cerebral cortex, and the brainstem in that area where the motor fiber coming from the cerebral cortex or coming from the motor cranial nuclei to join the corticospinal tract and descend down. شو قصدنا؟ يعني الcorticospinal tract بينزل from the cerebral cortex to the brainstem. And in the brainstem, we have a nuclei of the cranial nerves, like third, fourth, sixth. So there are fibers from these nuclei of the cranial nerve in the brainstem will join also the corticospinal tract. Will join also the corticospinal tract. Then, below the medulla, it cross to the opposite side, below the medulla, and goes to the spinal cord. So, this is another diagram. This is the motor area. This is the corticospinal tract. This is the internal capsule. It goes down, brainstem, and medulla. Below the medulla, cross to the opposite side, go to the spinal cord, to the anterior horn cell. And from the anterior horn cell, we have the root, nerve, muscle. From there, from the motor area, down to the anterior horn cell, this is called the upper motor neuron. Upper motor neuron. From the anterior horn cell, down to the nerve, to the muscle, this is a lower motor neuron. This is a lower motor neuron. So we divide the motor system into upper and lower. Okay. This is another diagram to show an example of any action. For example, holding this ball, we need many functions. For example, we need the motor area and the motor fibers. One, we need the sensory fibers. Go to the sensory cortex. This is the central gyrus. This is the central gyrus. The anterior part, pre-central gyrus. And the posterior part is the post-central gyrus. So the pre-central gyrus is the motor area, post-central gyrus is the sensory area. Okay. This is another action, complex action. For example, this person wants to hold this cup. Need many systems. Number one, we need the visual symptoms, vision, to localize where the cup is. Number two, we need the frontal lobe motor area to start the motor function. We need also the spinal cord, the motor fiber goes down. And also we need the sensory fiber to go down up to the cerebral cortex. Okay. So, in conclusion, أنا عيدها عدة مرات حتى تكون مفهومة لكم سهلة الحفظ. So, if we try to explain any motor action, holding a pen, writing something, any motor action. We need, number one, the pre-central gyrus, where the signal started there. And in the pre-central gyrus and the motor area. And as I mentioned, that in the motor area, the body is represented upside down. The foot up, the leg down. So we have different cells give us different signals. Signals to the upper part of the body and signals to the lower part of the body. So this is the motor area. Look, this is the representation. The foot and the toes is the upper part of the motor area. And then we have the trunk and down, then we have the face and tongue, the lowest part. This is the motor area, 3 central gyrus. Also the sensory area represented just the same, upside down, upside down. So this is the 3 central gyrus, motor area, the brown, and the blue one is the post-central gyrus, the sensory area. Okay. وهاي نقطة مهمة جدا. شوف بالموتر area there is a wide representation of the body in that area. شو راح يصير نتيجة ذلك؟ Because of the wide representation of the body in that motor cortex, so any lesion in the motor cortex will give us a limited loss of function, motor function. For example, will give us weakness on the opposite side, but it is limited. For example, monoplegia, one limb is only affected, upper or lower. So that's why if we have a lesion in the motor area, for example, stroke, CVI, because of anterior cerebral artery, the stroke will affect on part of the motor area. This will lead to weakness on the opposite side, but it is limited. Monoplegia. Monoplegia. While if we have a lesion below that in the corticospinal tract, we have a weakness on the opposite side, but it is more wide. Hemiplegia. Hemiplegia. Okay. So, نرجع مرة ثانية. We have the upper motor neuron. The upper motor neuron includes motor system from the motor cerebral cortex down to the anterior horn cells through the corticospinal tract, which crosses to the opposite side. I keep repeating this حتى يصير عندكم واضح الموضوع. So the upper motor neuron from the motor area, corticospinal tract through the internal capsule down to the brain stem, medulla, cross to the opposite side, goes in the spinal cord to the anterior horn cell. So the upper motor neuron from the motor area down to the anterior horn cell. While the lower motor neuron from the anterior horn cell to the nerve to the muscle. This is another cross-section. The motor area, pyramidal fiber, comes the fiber below the medulla, cross to the opposite side, goes down the anterior horn cell. And same thing for the opposite side. So we have part of the fiber cross, but other fiber goes directly, but the crossing is late. This is a diagram of the upper motor neuron. This side of the cerebral cortex and the other side just the same. Okay. Now, if we have a problem or a lesion in the upper motor neuron, we'll have the following sign. وهاي اهتموا بها جدا مهمة جدا. We have the following sign. Number one, we have loss of some, not all, some voluntary movement on the opposite side of the body. Monoplegia, if it is in the cerebral cortex, of the motor area. Okay, that's upper motor neuron. Number two, preservation of the reflex activity. Reflex activity is there or might be increased. And this is the difference between upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. Also, so increase in the reflex activity, hyperreflexia. Why hyperreflexia? Because of the loss of the inhibitory action of the upper motor neuron on the lower motor neuron. دائما في upper motor neuron وفي lower motor neuron في inhibitory action of the upper motor neuron on the lower motor neuron. من يصير عندنا upper motor neuron lesion, this inhibitory action is abolished. فالرeflex activity will increase. لأن الرeflex activity هي a function of a lower motor neuron. يعني تصبح اللور موتور نيورون مو بسيطرة الأبر موتور، يفقد السيطرة الأبر موتور نيورون on the lower motor. So, in upper motor neuron lesion, we have a positive phenomenon that increase reflex activity, hyperreflexia, and negative loss of voluntary movement. 2. Okay. So the sign of upper motor neuron, number 1, muscle paralysis on the opposite side of the body. Number 2, hypertonia, spasticity. And we call it spasticity because there's increase in the muscle tone, and it has the what we call it clasp knife type. ليه سميناها clasp knife type؟ هسه راح نشوفوا ليش. Or spastic type, spasticity. There is increase in the tone in the initial phase of the movement. So, called clasp knife. Clasp knife سكينة الجيب من تفتحها أول ما تفتحها هي مقاومة بعدين تفتحها. نفس الشيء. Spasticity, there is increase in the tone at the beginning of the movement, then it gives way. يعني resistance مو hold the way، لا فقط رفع الأول increase in the resistance and then it gives way. Called spasticity. Spasticity. هذا مهم الترم. And also this spasticity or hypertonia هاي مهمة جدا has a pyramidal distribution. شو نقصد pyramidal distribution? Means that the hypertonia mainly in the flexors muscle of the upper limb and extensors muscles of the lower limb. أعطيكم مثال على ذلك. من يصير عندنا CBA. يصير CBA اللي هو upper motor neuron. For example, a CBA in the left cerebral hemisphere. فكل الساين يصير on the right side of the body. يصير hypertonia. لكن الهايبرتونيا in the flexors muscle of the upper limb. إذن upper limb will be flexed, adapted. And extensors muscle of the lower limb. The lower limb extended. And it is weak. Hypertonia and weakness. So the movement, the right side is not moving. Only the left side. So the left side will move forward and will lift up the right side and put it forward. And this is called hemiplegic gait. Hemiplegic gait. ودائما هذا السؤال ينسأل بالأورال وأيضا يجي بعض الأحيان بالمالتيبل choice question. Multiple choice question. Okay. So we have also hyperreflexia and extensor planters. من تفحص البلانتر reflex in the foot, when you start making the plantar reflex, it is extensor. راح يشوفوهم تجون بالكلينيكال يشوفون البيج toe will go upward. The big toe will go upward. Extensor plantar. Extensor plantar. And this is all on the opposite side. Also, number 5, we have loss of abdominal reflexes. Loss of abdominal reflexes. Number 6, there is no muscle atrophy. But in the long term, we have disuse atrophy. شو نقصد بها؟ من يصير paralysis البادي الإنسان ما يستعمل المصل، بي بارالايز. المصل بها قاعدة إنه it's not in function، السايز مالها getting smaller، atrophied. This is called disuse atrophy. من الاسم disuse احنا ما نستعمل العضلة، فالعضلة بيقل حجمها. Disuse atrophy. Okay? And also, when we examine the muscle itself, we do the electrical activity in the muscle, it is not. So these are signs of upper motor neuron. تقريبا 6 إلى 7 نقاط لازم تحفظها. نجي على lower motor neuron, and that starts from the anterior horn cell, okay, anterior spinal root, then peripheral nerve, then the neuromuscular junction, then the muscle. وعندنا تيرم يسموه موتر يونت، وهي دائما راح تشوفوه. شو نقصد بالموتر يونت؟ الموتر يونت هو الانتيريور هورن سيل plus the axon plus group of muscle fibers. الشغلة المهمة إنه nutrition of the muscle depend on the lower motor neuron integrity. ولهذا من عندنا lower motor neuron, the nutrition will be affected and the muscle get wasted. اكو فرق بين الديسيوز اتروفي والويستنينج. الويستنينج باللور موتر نيورون والديسيوز اتروفي بالابر موتر نيورون. So هنا واضح. شوف we have the upper motor neuron starting from the motor area, corticospinal cord, goes to the brainstem, this is the bone, medulla, and then it crosses to the opposite side, going down, here on cell, goes down, motor area. This is indirect, and this is direct. This is the upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron, from the anterior horn cell to the root to the skeletal muscle. نفس الشيء بينه واضحة. This is the upper motor neuron, and this is the lower motor neuron from the anterior horn cell, root, nerve, neuromuscular junction, and muscle. ولهذا شوف حتى بالامتحان مثلا short case double basic short case شوف عندك weakness. أول سؤال تنسأل is it this weakness is it upper motor neuron or lower motor neuron؟ حتى تجاوب على هذا السؤال لازم تشوف الويكنس، تشوف التون، تشوف الريفلكسز and so on حتى تفرق بين upper motor neuron والlower motor. احنا اخذنا الساين بالupper motor neuron، هسه راح ناخذ الساين بالlower motor neuron. هاي نفس الشيء upper motor neuron lower motor neuron، وهذا واضح الupper motor neuron وهذا lower motor neuron. اوكي نجي على signs of lower motor neuron. Number 1, weakness and paralysis of all movement. تذكروا بالupper motor neuron some of the movement. هذا بالlower motor neuron all the movement voluntary and involuntary on the same side of the lesion. Like I can on the opposite side of the lesion. Number 2, the tone is low, hypotonia. يسميه flaccidity. هذا الترم حفظوه رجاء صوت رجاء called flaccidity. بينما بالupper motor neuron هو spasticity. هنا بالlower motor neuron flaccidity. flaccid. The reflexes are hyporeflexia or areflexia. ما في reflexes. هذا فرق ثاني. And abdominal reflexes are present. والplantar reflex بابنسكي is negative, flexible. لما تعمل البابنسكي تشوف البيكتو go down, flexible. هاي مهم، فرق بين الأبر واللور. And there is wasting of the muscle supplied by that lower motor neuron in 2 to 3 weeks time. ليش? Because the nutrition of the muscle depends on the integrity of the lower motor neuron. إذن بالlower motor neuron يصير عندنا wasting. بالupper motor neuron شو يكون عندنا؟ disuse atrophy. هذا فرق. أيضا من نعمل electrical study of the muscle نعمل EMG نشوف أكو finding. شو هو finding؟ نشوف في fibrillation. والfibrillation هي عبارة عن spontaneous single fiber contractions. Okay? It is invisible by the naked eye, but it is electromyographic feature. There is fibrillation of single muscle fiber. Also, there is fasciculation. With fasciculation, عبارة عن spontaneous contraction of a group of muscle fiber. It is visible by the naked eye. Then هذا الفرق بين الأبر موتور نيورون واللور موتور نيورون. إذا لو نقارن upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron. بالupper motor neuron, لأنه بالcerebral cortex, we have cognitive disorders, thinking وغيره. بينما هنا no cognitive disorder. Number one, weakness opposite side, weakness same side, spasticity, flaccidity, hyperreflexia, hyporeflexia, sensory alteration, no sensory alteration, pathological reflex, like Babinowski, okay? No Babinowski, or no positive reflex. And then high مقارنة بين the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. باقي لنا شيء قليل حتى نخلص المحاضرة. تكلمنا رجعنا صوت رجعنا تكلمنا على الموتورز سيستم. هذا أول سب سيستم من النيرفس سيستم اللي هو dealing with motor function movement. أيضا حكينا إنه الموتور سيستم is helped by other systems like the basal ganglia. حكينا عليها يسموها extra pyramidal system. extra pyramidal system وهذا عليه جروب خاص راح نتكلم عليه بكره إن شاء الله. تعطينا diseases called the movement disorders. Movement disorders like Parkinson's disease and chorea. هنتكلم عليها later on. The basal ganglia. Okay? And the basal ganglia, التعريف هو collection of ganglia. Basal ganglia. Okay? At the base of the brain. Collection of the ganglia. At the depth of the cerebral cortex. And has a complementary function to the motor system. So this is the basal ganglia. It has many ganglia. For example, we have the caudate nucleus, we have the putamen, we have the globus pallidus, we have the substantia nigra, and subtalented nucleus. هذا هنتكلم عليه in detail. إن شاء الله نتكلم على movement disorder. محاضرة خاصة. بقينا شيء آخر أيضا part of the central nervous system is the thalamus. والthalamus هو part of the central nervous system to deal with the appreciation and attention of the sensory perception. هي الثالاموس. This is the thalamus. السنسوري perception. كل السنسوري perception من يجي من البريفرال نيرفس سيستم ويدخل بالسباينال كورد وبعدين بالبرين ستيم. من يدخل بالسيربرال كورتكس اول مكان بيدخل هو الثالاموس. ثالاموس. اذا الثالاموس اول ستيشن تستلم sensory output. اوكي؟ وبعدين هاي الثالاموس will send it up to the central sensory cortex. Then deal with the sensory perception. عندنا الثالاموس وعندنا الهايبوثالاموس below it. This is the thalamus. Thalamus. Sensory information comes to the spinal cord from the thalamus, then goes up to sensory cord. Now, cross-section. This is cerebral cortex. This is the thalamus. And this is the hypothalamus. Okay. We have another important system, and that is the limbic system. That's more new. The limbic system is very important. And the limbic system deal with what? Deal with emotion and deal with memory. Limbic system. وعندنا أيضا الهايبوثالاموس. طبعا الهايبوثالاموس deal with the internal body environment. Internal body environment. So this is the limbic system. And this is the, for example, the hippocampus, the amygdala for emotion, and the hippocampus for memory. And the thalamus, and the hypothalamus, the limbic system. This is the limbic system, cross-section, hippocampus, amygdala, hypothalamus, and thalamus. Okay. إذا خلصنا السيربرال كورتكس ندخل جوا على البرين ستيم مرة ثانية ونتكلم إنه in that part of the central nervous system has the following functions. It is number one. شباب صوت. تسمعوا على اللي يتكلم يتأثر على الجنب يعني ما يخليكم. فالبرين ستيم لأنه below cerebral cortex has the following function. Number one, it contains or harbors the sensory and the motor pathway. The motor pathway is in the cerebral cortex through the brain stem to the spinal cord. The sensory system is in the spinal cord to the brain stem to the cerebral cortex. So out and in, out and in. The number one, which is very important. And this is the brain stem, this is the midbrain, this is the pons, and this is the medulla gland. Okay? Midbrain, this is the thalamus, midbrain, pons, and medulla. Also, it housing or contains cranial nerve nuclei. For example, third and fourth in the midbrain, 6 at the pons. طبعا 6 with third control what we call it conjugate eye movement. شو نقصد conjugate eye movement؟ نقصد انه for example when I want to look to the door, this eye go outside by the 6, this eye go to the inside by the third. علاقة بين the 6 with third. Okay? This is called conjugate eye movement. And there is internuclear mechanism. Why internuclear mechanism? Because there is connection between the nucleus of the third cranial nerve in the midbrain on one side to the nucleus of the sixth cranial nerve on the other side in the pons. This is called internuclear mechanism. Okay? So there is connection between the third and the sixth. and this connection through very thin fiber, this thin fiber called medial longitudinal fasciculars or bundle. If there is damage to this bundle, there is paralysis between the nuclei of the third and sixth, and this results in internuclear ophthalmoplegia. شو نقصد بالinternuclear ophthalmoplegia? When the eye goes to the outside, this eye will not go outside. There's ataxic nystagmus. هتكلم عليها بالclinical, بتجيهم بالclinical. والeye which goes to the inside, there is limitation of adduction. And then الINO, internuclear ophthalmoplegia, mean damage to the fiber which connect the third on one side to the sixth to the other side. فبنحرك العين conjugate eye movement. For example, I want to look to the right side. هاي الآي طالعة right side, there is ataxic nystagmus. While eye which goes to the inside, there is limitation of adduction. This is INO. Very important sign. Commonly seen, for example, multiple sclerosis. هنتكلم عليها بكرة إن شاء الله. شوف, this is the both eye baseline. For example, look to that side. This eye goes outside, and that to the inside. This abducted eye, adducted eye. Amma there is internuclear ophthalmoplegia. This eye which goes outside, there is nystagmus, ataxic nystagmus. While eye should be go inside, it does not go inside. It remains in the middle. INO. Okay. Also, the brainstem has center for the cardio and respiratory control. Most important, there is a system called reticular activating system, RIS. Reticular activating system, وهذا هو عبارة عن collection of neuron موجودة بالbrainstem deal with the sleep wakefulness of a normal human person. أنت مثلا الآن you are awake, but at night, for example, 10 hours ago, you are asleep. So there is sleep wakefulness. And that sleep wakefulness is carried out by the RIS, reticular activating system. Okay? So if the reticular activating system is on, you are awake. If the reticular activating system is off, you will go into sleep. So it is control the wakefulness and sleep pattern. So the RIS عبارة عن collections of the neuron in the brainstem. Okay. This is the brainstem, and this is the stimulus goes up to the cerebral cortex. If it is on, the patient is conscious. When it is off, the patient is asleep. Sleep wakefulness. This is physiological. Pathological, if we have a lesion in the brainstem, the RIS will stop and patient will pass into coma. ولهذا يجي سؤال مثلا, why patient have a pontine lesion, brainstem lesion, pass into coma? ليش? This is because of damage of the reticular activating system. Okay. Finally, خلصنا ما عندنا بقى شيء. We're down to the spinal cord. Well, spinal cord has many functions. And one of the functions of the spinal cord contains, number one, afferent and efferent fiber. الفايبر النازلة والفايبر الطالعة كلها بالspinal cord. أيضا it contains control the lower order motor reflexes. الرeflexes الموجودة كلها controlled by the spinal cord reflexes. وأيضا بالspinal cord there is a primary processing of the sensory information. Okay? before it goes up. Okay. يبقى عندنا إذا بقى عندنا peripheral nervous system و composed of afferent and efferent fibers. So there is sensory cell in the dorsal horn cell ganglion. We have motor cell in the anterior horn cell. Then عندنا anterior horn cell motor nucleus, motor fiber to the muscle. But the sensory fiber from the sensory receptors, sensory nerve, and goes to the dorsal horn cell. These are the peripheral nervous system. Now, peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system composed of subcranial nerve, spinal nerve, peripheral nerve, and the central brain of spinal. Okay. الأوتونوميك حكينا على الباراسمباتيك والسمباتيك. Okay. والفانكشن ماله هو unconscious control of the body physiology. مهم جدا unconscious control of the body physiology. So this is for the sympathetic and parasympathetic. For example, the sympathetic will deal with the pupil size, with the salivary gland, with the cardiac contraction, bronchi, and GI, and so on. High sympathetic, this is parasympathetic function. Also, the particular, the autonomic nervous system or cardiovascular. Okay. أعطيكم example of some lesion and some sign. For example, if we have cortical gray matter lesion, شو حيصير؟ The sign will affect the higher cortical function, lead to dementia, speech problem, aphasia, or seizure. That's cortical lesion. Why تجي بالمultiple choice. إذا كان subcortical lesion هو الكورتكس النيورون subcortex هو الوايت ماتر الفايبر corticospinal هنا راح يصير عندنا hemiparesis or hemiplegia hemisensory defect or mixed cerebral lesion. كده تكلمنا عليه. اوكي. إذا كان عندنا ليجن بالفرونتال لوب، الفرونتال لوب اللي حكينا عليه عندنا executive function، behavior function، وموتور area. هاي الأشياء المهمة بالفرونتال لوب. The frontal lobe lesion, so the problem with the frontal lobe lesion, as we said, frontal lobe contains primary motor cortex, central gyrus, speech area, Broca's area, frontal eye field, were higher order control, and bladder center. So, frontal lobe syndrome, هاي مهمة. Frontal lobe syndrome. شو هو؟ Number one, personality changes. نحفظ هاي. Personality changes. Especially with diffuse frontal lobe damage. Personality changes. Two, behavior disturbances. Two, behavior disturbances. Three, antisocial behavior. Antisocial behavior. Four, expressive dysphasia. Motor speech center. Has very, very, very important point. دائما تنسال فيها. على شكل multiple choice test. هاي تنحفظ 4 نقاط في الفرونتال لوب syndrome. إذا جاكم frontal lobe syndrome characterized by the following. يعطيك النقاط 4 بس وحدة منها تعطيك خطأ. لازم تعرف من الخطأ. مثلا يعطيك هذا personality changes ويعطيك behavior changes وانت social كلها صحيح. بس النقطة الرابعة مكان ما يقول expressive dysphasia لا والريسبتيف ديسفيزيا السنسوري، هذا راح يكون خطأ. هذا جواب على المالتيبل تشويس 100%. يجي سؤال مهم هذا. Also incontinence, frontal lobe because of bladder control, and anosmia. Anosmia, then olfactory fibers go through the frontal lobe. And contralateral hemiphagocysis. وأيضا return of primitive reflexes like the sucking reflex and grip reflex. Finally, focal motor seizure sometimes. Then سنقاط بالfrontal lobe syndrome. نجي على البرايتال لوب اللي هو integration of sensory information. هذا يسبب لنا الدومينant parietal lobe، يسوي لنا language disorders and calculation disorders. اكو تيرم يسمونه ابراكسيا. الابراكسيا حتى اشرح لكم اياها باختصار. Apraxia is inability to perform a complex function, motor function, in spite of a normal motor system and sensory system. يعني مثلا هذا البن موجود. I want to take that pen, pick it up and put it in my pocket. It is a complex action. تحتاج الموتر وتحتاج السنسر. زين. أو مثلا أنا I want to put my jacket on. I take the jacket, put my hand in the right. بالأبراكسيا I cannot do this. Why? The motor system is normal. The sensory system is normal. So where the problem is? واحد يجاوبني. وين المشكلة؟ وين المشكلة؟ المشكلة بالبلانينج. بري فرونتال، تتذكرون؟ حكينا بالموتر فرونتال لوب، عندنا موتر بري موتر وعندنا بري فرونتال. الموتر تعطينا الموتر سيجنال، لكن بري موتر تنطينا بلانينج. اعرف كيف بايدي واشيلهم. ولهذا تشوفون مثلا، اعطيكم مثال حتى ما تنسوا. The baby, children, they cannot dress themselves. ما يقدرون يلبسوا حالهم. الام هي اللي بتلبس. زين. الطفل ماله؟ هل عنده باراليسيس؟ لا، ما عنده باراليسيس. هل عنده سنسوري بروبلم؟ لا، ما عنده سنسوري بروبلم. بس يفتقد الى البلانينج. ما يعرف كيف يرفع الجاكيت، كيف يخلي الهاند، كيف يلبس. هاي البلانينج تتطور and getting mature as the child grow and become few years old and so on. فالبلانينج ينضج عنده فيقدر يلبس حاله بعدين. لكن هو عنده من early childhood عنده what they call physiological apraxia. أما إذا صارت في الادلتهود تصير pathological apraxia. واضح؟ يعني مثلا سأعطيكم مثال. I lift up the jacket, I put my right arm in the right sleeve, and the left arm in the left sleeve, and put it on. This is planning. لكن إذا كان planning ما راح يصير. I lift up the jacket. So instead of I put my right arm in the right sleeve, I put my left arm in the left sleeve. ما عندي planning. And I put it upside down. But this is not accident. There is no motor deficit, there is no sensory deficit, but there is a planning problem. فإذا كنت تعرف في نقاط ability to perform a complex motor action in spite of normal sensory and sensory motor system and sensory. هاي كلها تعريف. شوفوا هاي موتر اريا وهاي فري موتر. الفري موتر هاي الفري موتر. planning that coordination. نجي على التمبرال لوب طبعا contain the primary auditory cortex, vestibular cortex, and memory cortex. Occipital lobe or vision. اوكي طيب طولناها عليكم بس هاي مهمة لأنه هذا البيزك اوف. نعطيكم استراحة الآن.